Before the program, we asked you what topics would you like to hear New York Times journalists talk about. The first question from audience member Natalie Kazachkin is, will the EU be able to reinvent itself as a political ideal worth fighting for? Again, will the EU be able to reinvent itself as a political ideal worth fighting for? I'm going to put Roger on the spot and start with you. What do you think?
Well, Adam, I think, good morning, everyone. I think the election of Emmanuel Macron in France as president was an important turning point. He took a very big risk. He made Europe, a central part of his campaign. And at that time, everybody was trashing the European Union, and it seemed a very, very risky thing to do. And in fact, in the election, the turning point came on Europe, when in the debate between Macron and Marine Le Pen, she was asked about France giving up the euro, which is what she had proposed. And she blathered for about 2 minutes, and then Macron just looked at her and said, Madame, c'est du n'importe quoi, which is hard to translate, but roughly means, Madam, that's complete nonsense. And it was political suicide live on TV, and Europe was the turning point. And I think the Brexit decision, the election of Donald Trump in the United States has given people once again a sense of the importance of preserving what Europe has created on this continent, which is a zone of peace and stability and prosperity.
Mm-hmm. Katrin, what about you?
I would broadly agree with that, although I think this sense of we've escaped the kind of dominoes falling, because there was that sense a year ago when we thought the Austrian elections, the French elections, and other elections could go the wrong way. I think that should lead to complacency. And the one cautionary sort of thought on Macron, in my opinion, is that he has raised expectations incredibly high. He's 39 years old, and basically the future of Europe rests on this man's shoulders. It reminds me a little bit of Obama and of that sort of sense of hope that arrived in America, and Donald Trump was elected after Obama left. So that legacy, I think, is important to remember. If you raise expectations, you've got to fulfill them, and he has to deliver. If Europe fell apart, we'd all know what story to write. That's one cautionary point.
Mark, what's your...
So Margaret Thatcher, who wanted the EU to be weak, planned to do it in two ways. Firstly, by very rapid expansion. And secondly, by keeping the role of the European Parliament very weak, so the EU would have weak democratic legitimacy. And to me, it seems to me that the strategic questions for the EU, if it wishes to succeed, is one, how do you deal with the scale and the heterogeneity of the big membership? And secondly, and more importantly, how do you give it genuine democratic legitimacy? That the fundamental weakness in the EU, and the reason it's got into so many difficulties, is because of a sense of its remoteness, not just from Brits, but from people across Europe. And that, to me, is the real underlying question about the EU.
Right. James, what are your thoughts?
First, I'd like to make one sort of general program note. I think it's interesting that 2 of the 3 questions are asking us to predict the future one way or another, and I think in general, journalists should be fairly humble about venturing any predictions in the future. I'm delighted to see, we've talked about a crisis of confidence in media, delighted to see you have confidence that we're still able to predict the future given our track record, particularly over the last couple of years. We've constantly been astonished at the way events unfold. That said, I mean, I do think the big question is going to be what is the alternative? And we've seen even Donald Trump, for all his posturing about the ineffectualness of international organizations and the need for America to go it alone, so far has continued to, ultimately, we've seen it now on the Iran deal in just the last couple of days.
Right.
And so I think the question will be over and over again, well, what is the alternative? And this is a 60-year project that, by and large, has been a great success. And hearing the Ukrainian foreign minister last night talk about how passionately he identifies the future of his compatriots with Europe, there's a lot to work with there.
Farah, let's get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, to follow up on what you were saying, James, this project, let's step back and think for a moment, has been existing in some shape or form for 60 years. Celebrated its 60th birthday this year, 500 million citizens so far, before Britain leaves. 4 million square kilometers of territory that this thing covers. So, the whole idea of let's wipe the slate clean, well, it's a pretty big slate. And I think that the issue of EU reform is something that has been pushed onto the front burner of the EU Commission itself by Brexit. I think Brexit did have a big role in that. After Brexit, he gave a speech, the State of the European Union. Jean-Claude Juncker, the President of the Commission, said, we are going through an existential crisis. And he proposed all these different scenarios earlier this year in which the EU would either go tighter or go looser, pull in, pull out, tighten, etc. And but in the past week, Juncker made another speech, and it just seemed like he was suddenly bullish again and saying, well, the European economy has outpaced US economy in terms of growth for the last 2 years. So the wind is back in our sails. Let's forge ahead and do an ever closer union. And I'm not sure that that is something that will sit well with the citizens of Europe. I think basically it will be up to Angela Merkel, who we believe is the next chancellor of the German Federal Republic of Germany, and Emmanuel Macron and their dynamic, and see whether they are in any way interested in introducing some flexibility in the definition of the union.
Right. And I've encouraged my colleagues to completely disagree with each other, so we're going to jump in here. But Stephen, you spent a lot of time thinking about this, so what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I have two quick thoughts. One, I'm going to take the question literally. Will the European Union ever present a reality people will fight for? If by fight you mean fight, the answer is no. I mean, people fight for their country, they fight for their family, they fight for their sisters and brothers. They don't fight for Europe. Europe is too vague an idea. People talk about a European security identity. It's hollow. Particularly with Britain leaving the EU, it'll be even more hollow. NATO exists for that, not Europe. It's a very different idea. So will the idea of Europe ever create the kind of patriotic feeling that causes a young man or woman to put on a uniform and kill? No. Now, is it an idea that people will politically engage in? I think, yes. We've had, a wake-up call from Trump and Brexit. Germany's benefited from that. I mean, people are retreating toward what they know, and they may think the European Union, and particularly here, is not by far what it ought to be. It's not what it should be, but it's better than everything falling apart. So in this sense, Britain will be, I think, an object lesson for everybody else. And what always strikes me is even the people who are most critical of the European Union are sometimes the ones who are most pro-staying in it, because it does accelerate their role in the world. I mean, Germany, as everybody knows, it's too big for Europe, maybe, but too small for the world. But in the context of Europe, it has an enormous impact. So those are the distinctions I make. But there's also, just one last sentence, I mean, the divisions now are enormous, because if people take the euro seriously, which is what Macron wants to do, if the EU without Britain becomes more and more a eurozone concentrated place, you're going to have real fights with the countries of Central and Eastern Europe who really do not want to be part of that eurozone.
Just one thought. I think it's no coincidence that Brexit happened in Britain and Trump was elected in America, and that the populist dominoes so far have not fallen in continental Europe. If you look at the social mobility indicators and the indicators of inequalities, they are still far lower on the continent than they are in those two countries. And I don't think that's a coincidence. In that sense, Europe has something to offer in terms of some of the solutions that were discussed at this conference to the disaffection that people have with democracy. There's less inequality and more social mobility even today in France, despite the youth unemployment problem they have, than in Britain or in America.
Yeah. You mentioned...
Could I disagree slightly with Steve? I think it is possible to imagine a scenario where a German or a Frenchman or a Greek would die for Lithuania or Latvia, where citizens of one European Union country would die for the citizens of another European Union country. Well, you'll say that's not within the framework of the European Union, that's within the framework of NATO, and if President Putin did invade one of the Baltic states, Article 5 would be invoked, I still believe that, and you could see that scenario. And I think really that is Europeans dying for other Europeans in the name of two interlocking institutions that have assured again our stability now, as you were saying, since 1945. So I don't believe European patriotism as moribund as my friend Steve suggested.
Katrin, you had mentioned Donald Trump before, and I'd like to see if we can connect a bit of a bridge between the States and Europe. If we imagine an alternate universe in which we would be talking about President Clinton as opposed to President Trump, do you think that would have a different impact on what's going on in Europe if we had a different president? Anybody want to jump in on that?
I mean, yes, I think one thing is, and it's sort of been touched upon, Brexit managed to do what Europe on its own before did not manage to do for certainly a decade, and that is it created unity. It has unified people, and it has changed the narrative. I think you touched on that, Farah. The narrative has changed from a Europe is terrible, Europe is bad, there's bureaucrats siphoning away money, to a narrative that we need to work on this, actually the European economy is growing faster than Britain now. Everything is sort of reversed. So Brexit, this was Brexit, but Trump and sort of reinforcing Brexit afterwards helped with that. And if Clinton had come along, I think there would have been possibly more business as usual.
Okay. Anybody else want to?
Well, it was a wake-up call. It was a wake-up call.
Yeah.
God, we could lose this thing. We could actually lose this thing.
Yeah.
And it's a big thing. It's a very big, important thing. We don't want to lose it. So what are we going to do about it?
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, Clinton believed deeply, and it really went back to his experience as governor in Arkansas, traveling the world and trying to get investment and trade for his state. He believed deeply, and still does, I think, in the neoliberal idea that freer trade would promote tighter bonds and peace and prosperity for all over the long haul. The very idea that has been so profoundly challenged in the last couple of years.
Yeah.
I mean, basically, there is the issue that the EU itself admits, and Margot Wallström, the foreign minister of Sweden, who you will have heard yesterday, I spoke to her yesterday for a separate interview, and she admits that the EU has a fundamental communication problem, that there is a disconnect between the European Union and the little village person in Sweden, she said, in a mountain village, who doesn't understand what the EU is doing for he or she.
Right.
And so this disconnect is something that is a huge problem that the European Union has to address, because it has this perception, it is perceived as what Steve was saying, which is this kind of monolithic thing that's not worth dying for.
Right.
I mean, no success story has ever marketed itself as badly as the European Union, I think. I mean, it's really appalling. Look at something very tangible for EU citizens, which is free roaming. Free roaming is a European Union achievement that affects every single European these days traveling around Europe with their cell phones. Well, has the European Union made anything of free roaming?
Right.
Nothing. Zilch. It's a small thing, you might say, but those kinds of things could really help bring home what the EU does for its 500 million citizens.
Yeah. There were a lot of questions from you asking for predictions, and even though, as James said, we're not really in the prediction business, let's see if we can get some thoughts on this. Do you see the United Kingdom re-entering the European Union in the next few decades, and do you foresee other countries will leave the European Union?
Well, I don't see, once Britain leaves, and I believe it will leave, because time is too short to change it, to get back in would require more sacrifice than Britain would be willing to make, because Britain would have to reapply. It would not have the same deal that gets now. It might have to accept the euro in principle. I think once Britain is out, I'm perhaps sorry personally to say, I think it's out now. I think it will also, people will calm down and it will have a very friendly, decent trading relationship with Europe and a cultural one. And Britain will continue to pay for certain projects like the Erasmus College Exchange system and other things that will keep it close to Europe. But inside the EU, no. And the other thing, just a quick answer to the second question, I think we've been very clear now that no other country is going to leave. I mean, we've been through this psychodrama with Greece. God knows, you all know it. And Greece decided in the end it was worth staying. And Angela Merkel, who had a choice to make, and it went against Schäuble, who wanted Greece to leave, decided that she would pay what was necessary for Greece to stay. Now, other countries who are angry at the EU, like Slovakia, Poland, you look at the polls, they're incredibly pro-EU. They see the benefits of the EU. They're not leaving. They want to change it from inside, but not from outside.
Right, Mark.
I want to essentially agree with what Steve said. I think that there's a potentially tragic quality to what's happening in the following sense that I also think Brexit will happen. I think it's likely that within a decade the UK will want to re-enter the EU, essentially not through enthusiasm but through economic necessity. And I wonder whether the EU is going to want the UK. The British self-image is of we add so much value, our kind of empirical tradition, our skepticism improves everything. But I think it has been a unifying moment for the rest of Europe, which I think they're going to like. I think you will get some acceleration of integration, certainly with the central EU countries. Right. And the terrible danger for the UK is we make the EU better by being out of it, and even though we want to get back, they don't want us anymore. De Gaulle kept the UK out of the EU for years and years and years, and I see that bit of history potentially repeating itself.
I think if Britain leaves, and I think it will almost certainly leave, in my view, the greatest act of self-harm that a free country has inflicted on itself in a very long time. But if it leaves, and then a decade later reapplies for membership, I think Britain will have to live with the fact that it's become a complete joke.
Yeah,
I have to say, living in the UK for the last 15 or so years, I just, the language of Brexit after the EU referendum was quite tough. And Theresa May, the fact that she didn't get a majority in the latest election, means that she is kind of backpedaling. Every day you get them sort of backpedaling on this hard Brexit. So I don't really know how much of a hard Brexit we will get, and I'm wondering whether this will all be one big nice compromise and how much change we will get from where we are today. That, you know what I mean, isn't going to be a kind of plus ça change? I don't know.
Well, what would a compromise look like at this point?
I don't know.
In the end, Roger, do you?
Well, it looks like a compromise might take the form of a Norway type arrangement where there is free trade, free commerce continues. The question is, what the Europeans are going to say is, well, what about free movement? And that's what it was of workers, which is what it was supposedly all about. Well, look, Britain had a great deal in the European Union. It wasn't in Euroland, had control of its own currency. It wasn't in Schengen, it had control of its own borders. And this cry went up, we want our country back. Back from what? Back from what? That question has never been answered.
Right. All right, let's move on. Could I get a microphone up at the front of the room? We're going to shift to the second segment, which is the future of populism. And we had a question from Ben Ree. Thank you for this, Ben. And if you could pose your question to the panel.
Thanks, Adam. Ben Ray from the Global Challenges Foundation. I wanted to ask a prediction question, so my apologies. Will populism be a long-term trend that impedes global cooperation, or a stimulant to change the current system and perhaps build better global governance norms and institutions?
Okay.
Thank you.
I'll just repeat that just to make sure everybody heard it. Will populism be a long-term trend that impedes global cooperation, or a stimulant to change the current system and build better global governance norms and institutions? Who wants a piece of this?
I'll take it.
All right.
First of all, we have to kind of define the word populism. Populism is a word that's taken on great pejorative meaning, and I'm not sure that should be viewed that way, because populism basically means the people versus an overbearing elite, corrupt, etc. And populism is a term that's used to describe Marine Le Pen and National Front on the one hand, and Podemos movement in Spain, which is kind of diametrically opposed grassroots socialist movement, on the other. I think that the one thing that can be said for populism, even though it does irritate a lot of people, the word and the concept, is that it has served to keep multilateral institutions that have no counterbalancing power on their toes. The best system always is for an institution to have an opposition. Parliamentary democracy works because one party has an opposition which is criticizing it and keeping it on its toes. Multilateral institutions like the EU and the UN, for instance, don't have a counterbalancing force, and so the populist movements have served at least to, kind of question and bring a degree of opposition to those unchecked institutions.
So I would disagree a little bit with that definition. I mean, for me, a populist is somebody who appeals to the lowest instinct of the mob. It's basically somebody who doesn't go in for real solutions. It's somebody who goes in for easy scapegoats. And that happens when there's a vacuum of real leadership. So I would answer this question by saying that unless and until we have the mainstream politicians, if you want to call them that, the sort of liberal Democrats, doing what Emmanuel Macron did in France, basically be transparent about both the costs but also the opportunities that lie with that sort of liberal democracy. You're not going to you can't assume that populism will self-correct itself away, and it could be with us. And I think there's even a danger that it could escalate, because the EU, let's face it, has been a fairly benign scapegoat in Britain. But the grievances underlying the Brexit vote, for example, austerity, inequality, all the kind of issues you hear when you talk to people for an hour instead of just 10 minutes, those grievances will not be addressed by leaving the EU. They might even become worse. And at that point, you will probably go in for less benign scapegoats, and things like the other and populism and so on, anti-immigration sentiment will become worse. So my reading of the situation is that the populism that we're looking at the moment is less an us versus them, as the populists would have it. It's more an us versus us. And we need people to sort of step up to the plate on the middle ground and basically speak plainly about the challenges and the costs of changing our system.
I would have two things to say. One, in the simplest way, people vote, populists vote. It's democracy. We've been talking about democracy. We can't patronize the people who are voting for populist parties. We need to listen to them. We need to pay attention to their grievances, and their grievances are real. As an American, populism is nothing new. We actually had a Cap P populist party. William Jennings Bryan ran as a populist candidate, screaming against the elite and the gold standard, running on a silver standard. I mean, Richard Hofstadter wrote an essay I really recommend to you called The Paranoid Style in American Politics in the 50s. And it's a very good analysis of populism. The problem with populism is when it turns into semi-fascism, when it says we are the real people and the elite are other, that we represent the Narod, the real Greeks, the real Americans, the real Britons, and the people who lead us are cosmopolitans. They're in service to some other mysterious conspiratorial group, whether it's the Masons or the Catholic Church or the neoliberal elite or the bankers. Now that's the scary part. The other quick thing I would say is I find in Europe at least, parliamentary system seems better able to control it because it lets populist parties have their vote, but as a percentage of the population, it's not a first past the post thing, right? So that, okay, AfD in Germany may get 12 or 13% of the vote, which would be extraordinary. They'd be in parliament for the first time with a big number. In Sweden, Margot Wallström didn't talk about this, the Swedish Democrats get 20% of the vote. 20%. Now, you can't ignore these people. And in a way, Sweden has done something very undemocratic. They've created an anti-Swedish Democrat alliance to keep them out of government. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I think the key distinguishing thing is a word invented here in this city 2,500 years ago, demagoguery. And I think it's a rhetorical, the distinction is a rhetorical, a particular kind of instrumental politics based specifically on generating atavistic fears amongst people which are intrinsically divisive and intended to be divisive. And that to me is the kind of incubus, it's the demagogic incubus which we've got to be careful about. And I'm very pessimistic. I think the fundamental drivers of globalization, automation, mass migration, and economic inequality taken together are still going to be driving into European and other Western societies, and they create the space into which the demagogue can move. And in a horribly complicated world, exactly as Steve says, the person who can say, it's not complicated, it's really simple. If we get rid of them, life will be much better.
Yeah. I just stipulate to what Mark said. I feel like the dangerous force that these demagogues are awakening is this atavistic force. It's tribalism is what I worry about when we talk about populism. That's what I hear is tribalism. And one of the great forces that the EU was created actually to restrain. And what we've seen happen in the US over the last couple of years has been the emergence and really reemergence, as Steve says, of emergence of a white minority politics, a sense of grievance and a sense that prerogatives are being taken away, which is it's becoming a tribal idea in our politics. And again, it goes back to the brittleness of, and this is again to what I see as one of Hillary Clinton's failures in the campaign, the brittleness of the Clintonian idea of what works in this day and age. We simply failed to anticipate the degree to which globalization and technology, as Mark said, we're going to challenge that. And the really scary part is nobody has answers yet for how to address the tremendous disruption and the fact that we don't know where the jobs are going to come from.
I think we do have an issue of definitions, as various of my friends here have suggested. What we've had in the last few years, if you just dismiss it as populism, as Steve suggested, what you've had is a popular backlash. But you haven't had a popular backlash against nothing. I mean, we have had the financial crisis of 2008, we have had the Euro crisis, we had the Iraq war, we have democracies that have been delivering growing inequality, we've had the people most responsible for the crises that I just described walking away with complete impunity. I have a lot of respect for democracy, for the ballot box. I mean, the people who went and voted for Donald Trump for a reason. So we really have to distinguish between, I think, a popular backlash and populism. Then, however, when you see President Trump acting as a rabble-rouser, the leader of a mob, the word Katrin used, then you see the demagoguery and you get into populist politics, as you see it also in Europe. And I think the great question, and you've posed it in a way, is, are the democratic institutions of the United States and are the institutions of the European Union, which was set up in quite substantial part to resist this kind of thing, are they going to be stronger over the next decade, let's say, than these movements and everything that drives them, which Mark just summed up very succinctly? I think I'm less pessimistic than Mark. If I were betting, I would say that in the end, in answer to your question, it will be a stimulus to various forms of reinvention of our democracies rather than the triumph of the mob. And that, as Steve said, leads us right back to the first half of the 20th century.
That's great. All right.
If I can bring, sorry, may I?
Yes.
Just mention France very quickly. We have to remember that electoral systems are very much a determinant of how big or small these parties are. France has a 2-round voting system. And so in the first round, a lot of people cast votes for Marine Le Pen, who then in the second, who, if it were only a 1-round system, might not. So the plus 20% plus vote that she gets, how much would she get if it were just a 1-round vote?
Yeah, that's great. All right, let's move on. Is Nicholas Clifford in the audience? Great. If you could pose your question. And again, Ben, thank you for the question on populism. I'm going to invite you to my next dinner party. You bring the wine. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so Nick Clifford, Loughborough University. And it's about fake news and alternative facts. And it's inviting you to comment on the future, I think, as well, yet one more time. And it's this: how enduring do you think these phenomena will be, or will prove to be?
Great question. How enduring will the phenomenon of fake news and alternative facts be? We're going to put that question to our fake panel up here. Our CEO, Mark Thompson, has background as a journalist. He's also written a book on political discourse. Yeah. So I'm going to put you on the spot and start this off. How enduring will this be?
Well, fake news is eternal, isn't it? I mean, if you know your Shakespeare, Henry IV, Part 2 begins with rumour spreading through the land, and truth is sort of, miles behind as rumour sets forth. So it's eternal. I mean, the issue, it seems to me, is the mechanisation of fake news through social media and so forth, its ubiquity, and the fact that nowadays, arguably, it's a better business model than traditional journalism. You don't have to hire any journalists, and you can make everything up. So you can just make up the kind of stories people want to read about. So we've got, unfortunately, a kind of perfect storm of a money-making opportunity and also an open door for essentially kind of sovereign government psychological warfare against their geopolitical enemies, and we're seeing that happening as well. No quick fixes. The irony is that I think fake news provides a perfect moment for proper quality journalism to distinguish itself, and I think it may actually remind the public at large, who've kind of forgotten this, how important it is to support journalism. But I think we have to accept that we're going to do our journalism in an environment where, the truth will be out there, but it'll be surrounded by any amount of nonsense, and not just nonsense, some extremely carefully engineered lies, which are, not coming out of nowhere, and it's not teenagers in Montenegro, it's dark global forces trying to undermine our society. So I think this battle is not going to end anytime soon.
Yeah. James, you oversee our editorial page and our opinion pages. What are your thoughts on this? How enduring will it be?
Well, as Mark says, the idea of fake news has been with us since news has been with us, obviously. What is different and worrisome now is, and why this is a risk of being enduring, is that it's also a consumer-driven phenomenon. And we have more, as consumers of information, we have more ability than we've ever had to tailor the information that comes to us to our own expectations and assumptions about the way the world works. Overcoming that as a news organization is a real, profound challenge. Donald Trump said something recently, it was reported to have said something that's kind of a coda, I think, for this media environment after he and the minority leader of the Senate, Chuck Schumer, struck a deal a couple of weeks ago to basically extend the government's ability to pay its obligations for a few more months. It was the first gesture at bipartisanship we've actually seen in some time in Washington, and Donald Trump was apparently astonished by the media reaction, and he called Chuck Schumer the next day and said, "Fox News loved it, and your networks loved it too," meaning CNN and MSNBC.
Yeah.
And again, it's this notion that the media is itself going back to a 19th century idea of partisan kind of division, which is about fact and selecting particular facts to make your case. It's really about, to use the terribly overused word of the day, narrative. It's the story you tell to interpret reality. You know, the New York Times, Adam, you asked me specifically about our editorials. The New York Times is not an ideological newspaper. That is, it is not trying to lead a political crusade. We found ourselves in the last year or so having to defend the very idea that truth matters, which is not something we expected to find. One of our efforts to try to deal with this is to widen the range of voices, widen the range of opinion in our pages, encourage more debate. I'm sorry, now I'm going on too long, but I was so struck by what Philip Fernbach said yesterday, if you happened to hear his presentation. It's sort of about embracing the Enlightenment again. I mean, he enunciated 3 rules, which I think are ones I think about as a journalist all the time. One, that you know a lot less than you think you do. 2, that the world is a very complicated place, and I would add magical, horrifying, fascinating place. There's a lot to learn by going out into it. And then 3, that we should have intellectual humility as a result of that. And embrace other points of view. And we're making a very deliberate effort at the New York Times to try to model that.
Yeah, I think for all our efforts, a lot of people, James, would question your statement that we're not an ideological newspaper. I mean, there's a very strongly held view in many places that we are an ideological newspaper. And
I should have said aspirationally an ideological newspaper.
And yeah, fake news has been around forever, will be around forever, and as with everything, social media is a force multiplier, and that changes the dimensions of the problem. But what I think is very serious and maybe different is when you have the President of the United States with the force and gravitas, if that gravitas is still there, of the office, saying, we, the New York Times, are failing, and we are fake news, and CNN is fake news, and the Washington Post is fake news. Not the kid in Macedonia, but we, these institutions that uphold First Amendment in the United States, hold power to account. At that point, we're being, I think, led through the looking glass by our president. 2 + 2 = 5. We are the sources of fake. There's a game being played, and that game can be pretty mesmerizing and can lead people to lose the essential distinction between fact and falsehood. And that, I think, is very threatening to the functioning of a democracy.
Go
ahead.
Just quickly, 2 points. I mean, I think we cannot solve this problem without a serious commitment from the platforms. I mean, I think we need Mark Zuckerberg to take this seriously. I don't believe in the state taking any role in censorship or trying to decide what's real and fake news. But I do believe that those big technology companies are now at a stage in their development where perhaps mainstream newspapers were 100 years ago and started giving themselves codes of conduct. They need to think about the ethics of what they do, and it may be difficult. I mean, somebody was saying taking information off the internet is like trying to take pee out of a swimming pool. But I think trying will get us...
Thank you for that.
trying at least to address the problem and thinking about it deeply will get us at least part of the way. And doing it imperfectly is better than doing nothing, in my view. But we need to get the platforms on board. The second point I wanted to make is this uncomfortable tension that I feel even working for a very serious newspaper, between the economic pressures on our business and that environment. So, you know, we need to think about being viable, of course, and so we need to have people pay for quality journalism. I believe that's essential. And yet, we need to articulate the tension there, because we are precluding certain people from reading our journalism. And so, you know, when we are honest about whether what we do is in the service of strengthening democracy or it's in the service of strengthening our business model, we need to accept that it is not just the former, which is often how we like to articulate it, but it is both. And there is an inherent tension, and I think it needs to be on the table.
Yeah.
If I could pick up from
Sure.
Katrin, you were mentioning the financing of our news organization. I mean, there used to be a time, not so long ago, when to get your news, you had to go to the newsstand, take money out of your pocket or your wallet, and buy the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Le Monde, or the Frankfurter Allgemeine, Corriere della Sera. I mean, you had the physical, tangible paper in your hand, so you knew what the source of the information was. There was no question about the source. It was the New York Times or whatever newspaper you had. Nowadays, with digital journalism, with the fact that we're all reading our news on tablets or on a cell phone, basically we get this thing on Facebook, it's got an image, it's got text underneath, and we don't really know who wrote it. We do know, but we have to check. And so my final point on this is, I think that if the general public could adopt what we journalists have as instinct, which is to say, as a journalist, if I look on Facebook and I see some piece of news, I check the source. If it says The Guardian or the Frankfurter or the New York Times or whatever, I read the story. If there's no source, I don't read the story, because I'm like, what is this? I'm suspicious. And this is something that needs to be transmitted to the general public. Check the source.
I mean, one of the problems, I think Roger put his finger on this very nicely. President Trump is using us as a character in his play. He's giving us a position in his political theater. It's like a Punch and Judy show. And we're the one that gets punched. And we have to decide how to respond. Now, by saying, leave failing aside, that's Mark's problem. By saying we're fake news, what he's doing is undermining our real news, so that when we have a very good report about his connections in the campaign to Russia or his business ties, he can say, oh, well, that's fake news, as I've been saying right along. It's a kind of I think it's very thought out. It's not instinctual. It's what Erdogan is doing. It's what Putin is doing. It's a model of a kind of authoritarian democracy that is very worrying, because it undermines our role, which is constitutional in America at least, as a watchdog of these institutions. And the second point I'd make, which I really haven't done, I've done a lot of work on RT, Russia Today, and in fact, the New York Times Magazine just had another big story about the Kremlin's Sputnik, which is an internet news agency, so completely unregulated, and RT, which began as a kind of France 24, lots of stories about pelmeni in Siberia, Russian culture, bikini skiing in the mountains, all this sort of stuff. But with the Georgian war, and then especially with the Ukraine crisis and the seizure of Crimea, RT has become something very different. It really is. It's owned by the Kremlin. It's become an agent of the Kremlin. And it's the pretty face of something very insidious, which is what you referred to, which is the deliberate manipulation of fissures in democratic societies through the use of exaggerated news or fake news. In Germany, there was the famous case of Lisa, who was supposedly raped by migrants. Turned out not to be true, but it was pushed and pushed and pushed by RT and Sputnik, taken up by AfD, and then people cite it, on RT as something that's real. And then you also have this fascinating phenomenon of these automated bots on social media that are pretending to be real people, that are churning out this stuff. It's very deliberate. It's not always aimed so carefully. It's looking at places that work. And then you have the commercial aspect. Like a lot of the anti-Clinton stuff started with kids who were looking to make money off the web. They started with anti-Trump stuff, and they found out that actually they made much more money from anti-Clinton stuff. So that's what they did. So it's very hard to control, and it's up to all of us as consumers to be skeptical.
I had a terrifying experience a few weeks back, which was when President Trump said that the president of Mexico and the head of the Boy Scouts organization had both called him to congratulate him, the president of Mexico on the improved security at the border and the head of the Boy Scouts on the speech he'd made. And it turned out that these phone calls had never existed. They'd not taken place. And then in the White House, spokeswoman Sarah Huckabee was asked whether the president had lied, whether he'd lied in saying that these phone calls had happened when they hadn't. And she said something like, well, I wouldn't exactly call it a lie. And the terrifying experience was that I registered all this, read all this, and I shrugged. And that's the moment when things get dangerous, when we all start to shrug. When the fact that the President of the United States is bald-faced lying, and then his spokeswoman is coming out with Orwellian gobbledygook in the White House, and we start shrugging because, well, that's just the way it is. That's the danger point.
I do have a question about ideology, and it's come up a couple of times, and let's face it, there is a perception out there about that the New York Times does have an ideology, is pushing an agenda. Now, James, you've made a very concerted effort to bring in new voices onto the opinion page and our columnists. And I just want to get your sense of the experience. I mean, we brought in Bret Stephens from the Wall Street Journal, he made quite a splash with his debut column on climate change. And boy, the backlash from core New York Times readers, so many people saying, I'm going to cancel my subscription. Just, you were in the middle of all that. I'd love to hear your perceptions. Were you surprised by the reaction?
Let me briefly respond to something Stephen Rogers said, and I'll come back to that. First, it is true that Donald Trump, and I only speak for the opinion page of the New York Times, I do not speak for the news pages, so I should get that on the table first. He is going to come after us and after us and after us. He is going to accuse us of producing fake news. Other presidents have done this. We've been a punching bag over the years. It's never been as intense as this. That is absolutely true. That's the reality we're dealing with. The question to us is, so how do we respond? How do we handle that? And it's so important for us to not think of ourselves as part of the so-called resistance to Donald Trump to any greater degree than we're part of the resistance to Barack Obama. Yeah. You know, that's what we do. We're constantly interrogating presidents and holding them to account. And the flip side of the abuse that he visits upon us is he can't live without us. And he is talking to our reporters. He regards the New York Times as the legitimating, in a sense, news source. And that's because I think deep down he understands that our reporters are scrupulous and honest. Yes, the blowback to bringing in another and a more conservative columnist to the New York Times was really intense. And I will say inside and outside of our building. And it is, and Roger told the story about his moment of great fear. This is a great moment of fear for me as well about how diminished our capacity is now to really talk to each other and argue with each other. From an assumption, as Mark said in the really interesting panel yesterday, of good faith. right? That, I mean, this is the deeply important element that I think should be at the foundation of all of our own argumentation, is not an automatic assumption that the other side is motivated by a desire to tear the country down, or ruin the environment, but that you're trying to grope your way towards the right answers. John Stuart Mill said if you go back to the sort of fundamental texts that define at least the way we've traditionally thought about debate in the West, there are two main reasons you hear other points of view. One is you may be wrong. And I think that if anybody here thought seriously about that, they would recognize, yeah, actually I could be wrong. But the other reason, he said, is you may be right. And if you don't entertain other points of view, your beliefs and convictions over time will become hollow. And I think that's what's happening. That's why we should, to some degree, actually welcome this debate about democracy. We should welcome this debate about free speech, because it's forcing us, as we've heard over the last couple of days here, to articulate again why these values matter. The third reason he actually articulated, which is the one that is really true, is you're probably somewhere between right and wrong, you know? And you're not going to figure out, the other guy is going to be 10%, 20%, 30% right, and maybe even 70% sometimes. And you will be stronger if you incorporate those ideas into your own arguments. And we are losing, right now, the ability to do that. And that concerns me very deeply.
Okay, final quick question for the panel. I want to get everybody's quick take on this. We're at this interesting moment of paradox with this whole fake news phenomenon. From a certain angle, you can make a pretty strong argument that it's really bad for journalism. From a different angle, you can look at it and say, well, it's actually a really good moment for journalism.
Yeah.
So what's everybody's take? Mark, start us off.
Well, economically, this is a very... The centrality of journalism, and specifically of the New York Times brand in America and the world, is very good for business. Just to say, how should we think about that tension?
Right.
Making money. Well, I think what we want to try and do is we want, of course, to be able to sustain the journalism that we can do, and that means being hard-nosed about the reality that we believe the only way of doing it is by getting people to pay for our journalism, but to try and configure the way we do that so there's, as it were, a positive externality where a lot of people get to consume our journalism for nothing. We have around 150 million unique users every month, and we have about 3 million subscribers. So 147 million uniques are looking at our journalism without having to pay for it. And when events like the recent hurricanes Harvey and Irma happen, we take down our paywall entirely to let people... So we're trying to kind of walk this line where, this is my job, there's no point being so altruistic that you destroy your ability to do journalism. That's not going to help anyone. But to try and figure out a way of still keeping our influence and our ubiquity, and also the civic value of what we do, whilst being realistic about the reality and the central need to ensure that what we do can be sustained.
Right. Anybody else want to chip?
I think it's a good and important moment. I think there was this notion going around among millennials and others, I think for quite a while, that why should we pay for journalism? You know, it's out there, we can read pretty much what we like. And I think there's a real sense that this is a moment for vigilance, and one form of that vigilance is our journalism. And that's why people are saying, well, hey, if we want a really good investigative piece, and you've got to send people out for a long time, that costs money. So maybe, $12 a month or $15, whatever it is, that's worth paying. So I think it's a good moment. I think it's a moment of a kind of awakening.
Yeah. Farah?
Yeah, I do agree. But again, I think that this point about educating the reading public is very, very important, because you have the public, the readers, need to distinguish between the serious journalists, not because we're so great, but because we really do the homework and we really do leave no stone unturned, and something that has absolutely no source on it. And this is something, I don't know who can educate the readers, but this is a message that the editors of the New York Times, the CEO of the New York Times, I don't know how this message can be conveyed, but...
But even in high schools, there should be media literacy and these kinds of courses. It's become very important.
Well, I mean, you was talking about educating the readers. I mean, we're all in this business, ideally, because we want to serve the public in a way, right? But, you know, what interests the public is not always in the public interest. And I think there is that, again, this tension where, you know, I don't know, we were talking about this, you know, do we have to write 7 articles about the 20th anniversary of Diana's death? I mean, you know, people kind of want to read about it, but is that where we should be spending our time? There are these tensions. Of course, we don't want to be boring and too worthy and too earnest, and we want to write about fun stuff too, and not just about depressing things. And, you know, part of our job as well, and this is a hard thing, is to learn how to empower our readers with our information, because what's the point of just writing about terrible things and getting people down and actually making them feel disempowered? So this is another challenge, and this is why it is an important moment, where we need to write about stuff in a way that gives people agency. I think that's really important. Final point, you know, again, educating the public. I think we as journalists also need to educate ourselves more. And one impulse after Brexit, and I'm sure my colleagues in America felt the same, has been to do a lot more deep listening in places that perhaps one traveled not enough to before. I mean, I have these experiences. I mean, you go to, I don't know, you go to Hull in the northeast of England, or you go to even to Essex, you know, a 45-minute train ride out of London. You go to a market and you talk to somebody on a stall. Now, if you talk to them for about 10 minutes, they will tell you about the immigrants who've come in, how his city has changed, how, you know, he doesn't recognize his country, how he wants control back. And basically he's quoting sort of UKIP and Nigel Farage back at you. But if you stay for an hour, he will start talking about, you know, how few teachers there are in his primary school, how, you know, his neighbor who was a single mom was kicked out by the landlord because the rent went up too fast, how he's 19th on the waiting list for some operation at the NHS. So you realize that what he's really talking about is austerity. And the story you write as a result of that 1 hour conversation is a very different story. So I think it's a lot about educating ourselves as well.
I'll be very, very, yes, I agree, good. I'm going to be very, very brief. I think our best answer to fake news is our credibility, and we need to work at that. We make mistakes, God knows. We don't cover everything perfectly. We need to be very quick to admit our mistakes, to rectify them, to not be pompous, to understand we're part of a process. But truly, if people do not trust in us, and there have been reasons in the past why they may have doubted us, we're in trouble. So I think we really need to think very, very hard, try obviously not to make mistakes, not to be complacent, but when we do make them, to be very open and quick about resolving them. One reason, I have to say, I'm very sorry we've dropped the Ombudsman. I think what's replaced it is useless.
That's for another dinner party discussion. Okay. Final quick take from you, James.
I was just very happy to hear what Katrin just said, and I was reflecting on a former executive editor of the New York Times, who I was a political reporter at the New York Times, and he used to, as the current executive editor does, make us do a type of story that we all just hated. It was called a Voices piece. I'm speaking of Joe Lelyveld for my colleagues who go back away at and he would kick us out and send us out into the country to spend several days doing what Katrin just described, which was just spending our time. The rule was you had to not just call people on the phone, not stop them on the street. You had to walk the neighborhoods, knock on the doors, persuade them to invite you into their homes, and then spend an hour with them asking them about their lives and how they were likely to vote in the upcoming election. It took a huge amount of time. The stories, it was often very hard to write a very compelling piece out of it. And I only realized later that the whole point of that exercise was to teach us
Right.
You know, it was not about the story we were producing for that paper, but it was to season us and help us grow as reporters in just the way that Katrin is describing.
That's great.
Yeah, all I was saying is we need to find a way of distinguishing fact from fiction. I'm not saying that the public requires education by us.
That's great.
Yeah, and James kicked me down to Kentucky to go and write about Trump supporters about a year ago.
That's great. So first of all, I want to thank all of you for your great questions. I feel like we could talk all day, and please join me in thanking my colleagues up here. I hope you found this useful.